next speaker is Aikaterina Manoli from Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, Leipzig, Germany. Please.
Hi, I'm Katerina, and today I will talk to you about a study that examined the role of the developing cerebellum in social cognition, and more specifically, theory of mind. So the cerebellum has traditionally been considered a motor brain region. However, a surge of research over the last 30 years or so has showed that it's actually involved in a very wide range of cognitive processes, both in terms of its functional involvement in a bunch of motor and non-motor tasks, but also in terms of extensive connectivity with both motor and non-motor regions of the cerebral cortex. And when it comes to connectivity, a prominent theory is that the cerebellum is involved in predictive processing by encoding and storing internal mental models of different states and different behaviors, and then feeding them forward to the cortex to aid with cognitive state and behavior optimization. And in this particular study, we were interested in one aspect of behavior or cognitive processing, which is theory of mind, or our ability to infer the mental states of other people, for example, their desires or beliefs. In the cerebral cortex, theory of mind consistently recruits a widespread network of frontal, temporal, and parietal regions, also known as the theory of mind network. However, recent research in the adult cerebellum has also showed that it's actually also present in the posterior parts of the cerebellum, namely lobules crus 1 and 2. When it comes to development, the emergence of theory of mind is associated with a developmental breakthrough between the ages of around 3 and 4, which is when children start passing theory of mind tasks, for example, when they're able to point out a false belief in another person. And this is also associated with age-related changes in the theory of mind network, for example, increases in cortical thickness and surface area, as well as greater functional specialization of this network to selectively be activated for theory of mind stimuli. However, a question is, how could the cerebellum also contribute to the development of theory of mind during this developmental time window? And this is an important question because there are lesion studies in pediatric populations that suggest the existence of critical periods of cerebellar development that, if disrupted, lead to severe impairments in social cognition later in life. So our aim here was to examine how the cerebellum contributes to the early life development of theory of mind. To do this, we used openly available data of 41 children between the ages of 3 and 12, and also 2 different adult samples because it was important for us to be able to compare the role of the development and the adult cerebellum in theory of mind. All participants watched a same in-scanner movie that contained scenes that trigger theory of mind and pain processing, and children additionally performed an out-of-scanner task, a false belief task that helped us identify whether theory of mind has emerged in these children yet or not. In terms of analyses, we initially did contrast-based analysis between the theory of mind and pain scenes to be able to identify the cerebellar theory of mind clusters, and then we did functional and affective connectivity to see how these clusters interact with the theory of mind network. And importantly, we did all of these analyses in both adults and children to be able to compare. So here are the results of the contrast-based analyses. These are the results of group-level one-sample t-tests for the theory of mind versus pain scene contrast, corrected for the false discovery rate. And here the interesting findings are that children with theory of mind, as classified by the out-of-scanner task, demonstrate functional activations in the posterior cerebellum, circled there in red, that are very clearly absent in children without theory of mind. And interestingly, these clusters coincide with functional activations that we also found in adults during the theory of mind processing scenes. And this suggests that there might be some functional changes in the posterior cerebellum between the ages of around 3 and 5, which is when theory of mind emerges. Next, we wanted to see how these clusters interact with the theory of mind network, and for that we conducted seed-to-voxel functional connectivity by setting our seeds in the cerebellar theory of mind clusters that you just saw, and then correlating them with every voxel in the cerebral cortex. We set our first seed in the R-CRUS1, which was interestingly a cluster that we found in children regardless of theory of mind abilities. And we saw that this particular seed was connected with core regions of the theory of mind network, for example, the TPJ and the precuneus, but interestingly with regions that don't typically belong to the theory of mind network either. For example, the cingulate, the thalamus, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And when directly comparing connectivity in children with or without theory of mind activities, we found that these regions that don't belong to the theory of mind network are mostly connected with the cerebellum in children without theory of mind activities. However, these clusters are of course small and probably should be taken with a grain of salt. However, when we moved on to the R-Cruz2 seed, which was found only in children without theory of mind, we found very strong and almost exclusive connectivity only with the theory of mind network in the cerebral cortex. And this was also prominent when directly comparing connectivity in children with and without theory of mind, where again we see regions like the precuneus and the TBJ being more connected from the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex, which demonstrates that functional connectivity between the cerebellum and the theory of mind network increases as a function of children's theory of mind abilities. Lastly, we wanted to see if we can examine the directionality of these connections, and for that we conducted dynamic causal modeling, which briefly is a technique that tells us how much activation in a seed affects activation in a target in the context of an experimental condition, in this case theory of mind. And this helps us see the directionality of connections by examining how much activation in a seed increases or decreases activation in a target. And the seeds and targets in questions here were again the theory of mind clusters that you saw before. So here are the results for both groups and children, and also a direct comparison between them. And the interesting results here are that children with theory of mind demonstrate almost exclusively unidirectional connections from the cerebellar theory of mind seeds to the theory of mind network. However, when we move on to adults, we see an inverse pattern where we have unidirectional connections from the cerebral cortex of the theory of mind network to the cerebellar theory of mind clusters. And this is prominent in both adult samples, but also when directly comparing adults with children with theory of mind. So to sum up, we found that there are functional clusters in groups 1 and 2 that are related to the early life theory of mind emergence. We found that connectivity between the cerebellum and the theory of mind network increases as a function of children's theory of mind abilities. And we found that children with theory of mind, when we look at the directionality of these connections, demonstrate mostly connections from the cerebellum to the theory of mind network, whereas adults demonstrate an inverse pattern. And this is very interestingly associated with the recent conceptualization of cerebrocerebellar connectivity in theory of mind, which suggests that early in life there is a forward model where connections primarily start from the cerebellum and move towards the cortex, because this is early in life, at least, is when we build social mental models by learning the outcome of other people's actions. And then later in life, we see an inverse model where connections from the cortex are more prominent, because perhaps this way we can more fluidly utilize the social mental models that we built early in life. And of course, this brings up exciting opportunities for future questions. For example, examining the effect of different ages to see when that flip possibly happens, and also examining the effect of structure, for example, volume or structural connectivity in the cerebellum, to see if structure also plays a role in theory of mind emergence. So I would like to thank my supervisor, the collaborators, and here's also a preprint of our paper, and I hope that I have encouraged you to also look more into the cerebellum when conducting social cognitive or developmental research. Thank you.
Wonderful. So any questions from the floor? Or yeah, there is one question on the app. Is it possible to know the effect of age in these networks instead of theory of mind?
So you mean if there was a developmental effect over and above theory of mind? So we actually controlled for the effect of other cognitive tasks that children performed. So there was an inhibition, response inhibition question, and also intelligence. So we used that also as covariate in our models, and we found the same effects. And also to further test for the specificity, we flipped the contrast to test like the pain versus theory of mind scenes, and we found non-overlapping regions with the theory of mind clusters, which were similar in both children with and without theory of mind. So we do believe that there is more specificity. But when it comes to the effect of aging itself, that is hard to like tease apart. But what we think happened here is that most of our children were between the ages of 3 and 6, and we only had about 5 observations that were above the age of 6. We added those, of course, for extra power. but we think that it's usually earlier or younger ages that drive these effects.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I think my question is related to that one. But first of all, I don't remember. I'm very familiar with the data set, but I'm not familiar with what kind of task they used for measuring the theory of mind ability. Is that a false belief task?
Yes, it's a false belief task out of Scanner. So they used, it was narrative questions. So children asked 6 questions about false belief of a character in a story. For example, a character would hide snacks somewhere, then they would go to look for the snacks, they would be in another location, and children would have to, we were asked where the character would look for the snacks in the story. And they were scored between 0 and 6 because there were 6 questions.
Yes, so we know that the theory of mind ability is largely correlates with the verbal ability, especially with the young children. Like, do you have any idea whether that would have influenced your data?
Yes. So unfortunately, they did not include such a task or a way to actually regress for that, but that would be really interesting to look into in a further study. Yeah.
Another question about cerebellum. So normally most of the time when we just scan the data, if your research interest is not related to cerebellum, then most of the time you just remove you cut the
Yes.
image. And do you know that they include all cerebellum?
Yes, so the original sample had 122 children, but only 41 had full cerebellar coverage. So that's why we used those. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, there maybe one last question, quick question. So adults with autism spectrum disorder struggle with social interactions, and how would dynamic functional connectivity look in this scenario?
Dynamic functional connectivity or dynamic causal modeling? So.
Maybe dynamic causal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we could have used participants with autistic traits. So in our model, we were able to add actually a covariate when comparing, for example, children of different ages or children with adults. So of course, if you have a sample with autistic children, you could also directly compare and look at the differences there. And of course, we would expect to find effects because at least autism is related to very strong abnormalities in the cerebellum, particularly in the posterior cerebellum where we found our effects as well. So we would expect differences there.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.